Welcome back to the Great and Spacious Building. I'm your host, Dr. Wayne Denton. And for this week's episode, we're going to dive into the years between 1945 and 1970 in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're going to continue with our discussion of the race and the priesthood issue. And what we're really going to focus on here is what changes are we going to see in the church between 1945 and 1970? And we also want to look at what are the prompts for those changes. So what's prompting all of these changes in the church at this time? So getting started, let's just dive right in here. 1949 is where we're actually going to start here. And with 1949, I want to discuss back in our last episode, which will be linked somewhere up here, the first official statement post-Brigham Young that we truly get about the racial priesthood ban. So again, back to 1949. Again, there's this guy named Lowry Nelson. Lowry Nelson he's sort of digging into this issue. He's asked this question by Heber Meeks. Hey, what's it like if we, move into Cuba? And Lowry Nelson, having a knowledge of Cuba's demographic makeup, he responds in a not so friendly way that this is sort of nonsensical to be seeking pure white individuals in Cuba. So the prompt for this statement from the first presidency is racial issues concerning possible church expansion into Cuba. And the statement from the church in 1949 explicitly affirms the priesthood restriction as a direct commandment from the Lord. So we place this process, this belief, this practice, we make it a commandment of the Lord. It's not a policy, it is therefore a doctrine. And again, the rationale for making this doctrine from church leaders is that it asserts that the restriction was founded on the pre-existence of our spirits. We've talked about that in previous episodes as well. The institution of this idea that it's not just because you're black, it's why you're black. And that relates to what you did before you actually arrived on earth, the pre-existence doctrine of the church. And with this, the idea that some spirits were less valiant, and consequently, they were born into bodies and denied the priesthood as a handicap that they're willing to assume, saying that, hey, when you came to this earth, you made an agreement that you were okay with being black, and you're okay with being denied the priesthood because coming to earth is more important than any of that. So what we're going to see after this official statement from the church is that things are just going to blow up. Things get chaotic in the United States. The race issue is no longer taking the back seat. We're in the full-out civil rights movement, and the church isn't going to be able to really hide away from this teaching anymore. And we're going to start to see the church have to be more active in answering questions of why do you have this practice and what are you going to do about it? And we're also going to see more backlash focused toward the church as well. Talking about the ban again in this period of time. So the ban is defended on theological grounds that position black people in an inferior status, often leveraging interpretations of the scriptural curses of Cain and Ham. We've seen those biblical curses discussed over and over again. The Book of Abraham from Joseph Smith, the way that Brigham Young takes that, capitalizes on it to create the ban, and we've seen that throughout the 20th century to this point in our discussion in this series. And the restriction was framed not as discrimination by man, but as God's will, based on the spiritual standing of black people. So again, this is taking ownership of the curse off of the leaders of the church and saying, well, God wanted it that way, which is extremely problematic because my understanding, and I hope many people's understanding, I may be putting my own bias in here, but God's not racist. So this explanation is a little bit difficult for some people to swallow. And just some quotes here. The Negro was cursed as to the priesthood and therefore was cursed as to the blessings of the priesthood. Continuing on, this Negro who in the pre-existence life lived the type of life which justified the Lord in sending him to the earth in the lineage of Cain with a black skin, if that Negro is willing, when he hears the gospel, to accept it, he may have many blessings of the gospel. He can and will enter the celestial kingdom. He will go there as a servant. So we've seen this servant mentality with the sealing of Jane Manning James. In a previous episode, we talked about that. But what we're starting to see here is segregation. Segregation, really big trend in society post-Reconstruction, post-Civil War. Obviously, the civil rights movement's going on here fighting against segregation. But segregation is being presented here as divine design. It's not the works of men, but in the church, this is actually divinely designed. And some leaders of the church are actually going to assert that social segregation was divinely intended. For example, we have the quote here, when the Lord chose the nations to which the spirits were to come, determining that some would be Japanese and some would be Chinese and some Negroes and some Americans, he engaged in an act of segregation. I think the Lord segregated the Negro, and who is man to change that segregation? It reminds me of the scripture on marriage. What God hath joined together, let not man part asunder. Only here we have the reverse of the thing. What God hath separated, let not man bring together again. And again, all of this is based in all the way back to Brigham Young. This is based in a fear of interracial marriage. The unstated goal of much of the opposition here is the fear of miscegenation. In our last episode about David O. McKay and his personal journals, he says, I'm all good with this. I think that blacks should be equal, but equality is going to lead to intermarriage, and we don't want that. The ultimate goal of the civil rights movement, one apostle argues, was miscegenation. He's not just seeking the opportunity of sitting down in a cafe where white people sit. It appears that the Negro seeks absorption. With the white race, he will not be satisfied until he achieves it by intermarriage. And here this is Mark Peterson saying this, by the way. And continuing on, as to the Negro, of course, there's only one possible answer. We must not intermarry with the Negro. So Mark Peterson, in our last episode about David O. McKay, we addressed that he was unable to overcome the lack of consensus in the Quorum of the 12 about possibly lifting the priesthood ban. And we're seeing here some of the oppositional voices to the idea of lifting the priesthood ban. This first one that I just read here from Mark Peterson is asserting that the civil rights movement and this movement for equality of African Americans is less about social equality, less about civil equality, and more about the aspect of black men being able to marry white women, or black women marrying white men. And because of the divine origins in the church's purview of this ban on the priesthood via racial means, that would lead to many people that had pure white blood by intermarriage losing the opportunity to receive temple blessings or to receive the priesthood. So intermarriage between blacks and whites threatens church growth. And that's what we're really seeing here from Mark Peterson in these quotes about intermarriage. One of the other large voices that we're going to run into, that David O. McKay ran into within the Quorum of the 12, is Ezra Taft Benson. In the future, Ezra Taft Benson as a political force and changing the church narrative regarding political thoughts, he deserves a podcast series of his own, and I plan on doing that in the future. And most of the info that I have there, I'd like to thank Matt Harris on for a couple of books that either he edited or wrote about Ezra Taft Benson, but also the FBI files about Ezra Taft Benson. they're all out there, and it's a really interesting read when diving into anything about Ezra Taft Benson. But Ezra Taft Benson, in the Quorum of the 12 at this point, he is a strong opponent to the idea of ending the racial priesthood ban. He really sees that the civil rights movement has been co-opted by a communist movement. And with this, he defends the ban by saying that we're preventing communism from making its way into the church or taking roots in the church or therefore the greater United States. Apostle Ezra Taft Benson, he warns about the political dangers of the civil rights movement, stating that communism is the greatest mortal threat this country has ever faced. Again, a little background about Ezra Taft Benson. I'm not going to dive into it too deeply, but he served with Dwight D. Eisenhower in his cabinet. We also have, he's going to be a big fan of Robert Welch and a proponent of the John Birch Society and that anti-communist, hyper-conservative movement. Going to be a big fan of Cleon Skousen. They're going to partner up with Cleon Skousen's position at BYU and Ezra Taft's position in politics, but also in the leadership of the church in the Quorum of the 12 and eventually becoming a prophet. They're really going to shift the church's political leanings during their time in power, both academically and theologically through their leadership. Benson, he's going to see civil rights as a tool for advancing communism. He claims that communists were exploiting racial tensions. These racial tensions, these protests, they're not about equality. They're actually about asserting a communist agenda. I quote here from Ezra Taft Benson, how the communists, they were using the civil rights movement to promote revolution and the eventual takeover of this country. So again, this isn't about finding general equality. It's about blacks taking over the country and asserting a communist agenda through their racial lens. And another quote here, what do you know about the dangerous civil rights agitation in Mississippi? Claiming that in Mississippi, all of these movements here are communist agitators that are using the lens of equality to really hide what they're truly focusing on, that behind it all is this secret communist agenda that is not being seen because the bleeding hearts in the government are just looking at the inequality of the Jim Crow era and segregation, and all of that is masking the truth behind civil rights. There's even internal accusations here. So Benson is going to make comments that are going to imply that church members that are supporting the civil rights movement are being deceived. He does this in speeches at both a general conference and in general. So quoting from some of his speeches here, now, brethren, the Lord has never promised there would not be traitors in the church, alluding to the idea that, some people were just being deceived by the civil rights movement. And you think that you're seeking equality, but you're really seeking to be oppressed by a communist regime. And he continues, we have the ignorant, the sleepy, and the deceived who provide temptations and avenues of apostasy for the unwary and the unfaithful. Again, pointing out that if you're in support of this, you're being deceived. You might actually be in apostasy too. So to be seeking equality for blacks in society may be a form of apostasy for church members because you're not seeing what you're actually doing. You might be doing the devil's work instead of doing the Lord's work. Because according to Ezra Taft Benson, the Lord's work is the separation of races via the racial priesthood ban and the prevention of communism, which is being done by the church by denying the miscegenation and intermarriage of black and white members. So segregation is actually God's work. And integration, well, that's the communist agenda, and we don't want that. all of this loud output by leaders of the church, such as Mark E. Peterson and such as Ezra Taft Benson, that's going to be met with a lot of resistance. You have members in the Quorum of the 12 in the First Presidency, such as Hugh B. Brown, who are going to speak out against the racial priesthood ban. There's actually an account where Hugh B. Brown tells someone that the ban is on its way to being lifted, and he's misspeaking there. He's hoping that David O. McKay is going to sign on to this. He knows David O. McKay's feelings about this, and he feels like there's a chance to get David O. McKay to actually lift the ban. That's not going to happen, and Hugh B. Brown is an interesting story if you follow the church today. Dieter F. Uchtdorf, when after Thomas Monson dies, he gets demoted from the first presidency. Many people, if you listen to John DeLynn, call it being Hugh B. Brown, because Hugh B. Brown was in the first presidency. When David O. McKay dies, he's seen as too liberal in pushing for the end of the ban, and he's actually going to be removed from the first presidency as well. But Hugh B. Brown is one of those interesting figures in the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency that are against the ban and advocate for the changing of the ban. Again, I could do a whole episode on Hugh B. Brown, and I probably will in a future date. But what we end up getting is the church's insistence on maintaining the ban. It leads to institutional strain, internal and external protest, and we get many disputes amongst church members and amongst church leaders all the same. And focusing on some of the external promptings for what's going to happen with the church in 1969 with the next official statement about the priesthood ban. BYU, the church's flagship university, is going to face significant backlash. At first, this is going to come in the academic realms, and we're going to see boycotts from universities, specifically the University of Wyoming and Stanford. They're going to boycott playing BYU in games on the grounds of their racial policies. And this is going to be shocking to BYU's leaders as they're looking at this and seeing that, wow, our theological teachings that are reflected in our policies at BYU, such as the recruitment of Black players. We see in the 60s there's actually going to be the suspension of many Black players. And this is going to lead to other colleges taking a stance that this isn't okay, and we're not going to participate in this by making BYU money by showing up for games with BYU. So they get hit financially with this threat of boycotts from these other universities. There's also the threat that they could lose access to the conference itself. These two schools in their conference threatening to boycott, that could lead to other schools within the conference threatening to boycott, and possibly BYU being kicked out of their conference, which would lose access to funding from the conference. It would lose access to support from the conference, and scheduling just sort of becomes a mess when you're without a conference or independent, like Notre Dame by choice though, or Liberty University up until a couple of years ago. And what we see here is the federal government is also going to come down hard on evangelical schools, specifically Bob Jones University, who is going to face the loss of federal funding for their programs due to their racially discriminatory processes. And BYU really fears that what happened to Bob Jones could in turn happen to them. Internally, we're also going to see faithful Black members start to communicate their anguish directly to church leadership. This isn't just an external thing. There's also some internal movements going on. David Gillespie is going to write to church leaders that he's often felt left out because white men had the brotherhood of the priesthood. And he didn't have that. He lamented the difference in marriage rituals. Bishop Thomas, by the power invested in him under the laws of the state of Utah, married David Gillespie until death do him and his wife part. Very similar to a traditional religious ceremony, but it's lacking that eternal nature of a temple marriage. So David Gillespie is questioning, why the difference here? Why am I not afforded, because of my race, the eternal sealing power? He detailed the bitterness of not being able to bless his child. Again, this isn't just about him getting married, but also needing the priesthood to give his child a simple blessing. A lifelong friend had to give him a father's blessing by proxy. David couldn't bless his own child because he was black and wasn't afforded the priesthood. So we have to have another member of the church, a friend, a family friend, give his child a blessing just because David is black and his friend is white. He notes that he's denied the privilege that some fathers have had since the dawn of creation because he lacked the holy priesthood. David Gillespie, in his account, he ends the account with this anguish that ends just with the question of, is this the will of God or the will of man? The 1949 statement on this policy makes it known that this is a doctrine, but David Gillespie, he's questioning here, is it really God's will that blacks are subject to this discriminatory process, or is it the will of men in power? Is it reflective of the social norms in society of the day, the racism that is running rampant through society, even in the midst of the civil rights movement? And that question is valid. We also, during this time period, we see the Genesis group. It's created, so church leaders end up creating a specific black-led ward of sorts in Salt Lake, and the main objective here for the Genesis group is to get the priesthood and do missionary work among the black, both in America and throughout the world. So the Genesis group sort of being this affinity group or test group of what it would look like to have blacks lead their own wards. Again, without the priesthood, they do need proxy leadership and bishop roles. But for the most part, the Genesis group is going to serve to see what black leadership could be like. The group is told that the first presidency and the 12 on one occasion in 1971, they prayed in the temple. This is the Genesis group receiving this notice that the first presidency in 1971, they prayed in the temple about whether black members should hold the priesthood, but they were not in agreement on the question. Likely the Marquis Petersons, the eventual Delbert Stapleys, the Ezra Taft Bensons, with those views that we've outlined earlier in this episode, they're not able to sign on to the idea that maybe blacks should have the priesthood. And church leadership is going to wait for what they're going to call a revelation. They need a revelation, and what they're really saying with that is they need consensus. They need every member of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency to agree that, yes, we should lift the ban. And with these loud, strong opinions addressed earlier in this episode, that's really difficult to come by. With someone like Ezra Taft Benson that just sees this as a communist ploy. With someone like Marquis Peterson who says equality is just a tool for intermarriage and the weakening of the white bloodline. This is going to be really difficult to come by. But with all of this pressure from groups like the Genesis Group, external pressure from colleges and the federal government, fear of the loss of funding, internal groups, and members like David Gillespie, we do see the church issue another statement on the priesthood ban. And we're going to see the way in this statement that's really the church is going to soften its view on this teaching, this doctrine from 1949. What we get here, the context, the statement is signed by two members of the First Presidency, Hugh B. Brown and N. Eldon Tanner, and it's noted in Brown's journals that he was reluctant to sign this because it's not what he wanted. He doesn't want to get up and sponsor the ban. He's been moving to end the ban in his time as a member of the First Presidency, one of David O. McKay's counselors, but he's going to sign this to maintain an appearance of consensus amongst the members of the First Presidency. So the actual content of this announcement, it reaffirmed the denial of the priesthood. So it's not going to change anything about the black priesthood ban. It's going to say that blacks are banned from receiving the priesthood, but it shifted the rationale. So if we went back to 1949, what we get here is this is an ironclad doctrine based on the pre-existence. In the 1969 statement, we get a reversal. It's not the pre-existence, but the restriction was instituted by Joseph Smith going back to that original statement, and it had been reaffirmed by successive presidents, meaning it has been taught over and over and over and over and over again. And they really lighten the stance, though, and they say, the reason for this, it's reasons we believe are known to God, but which he has not made fully known to man. So they place the ownership for this on God. He knows the reasons. We don't know. Could we ask in the temple? Could we pray for it? Sure. But if we have, we haven't gotten an answer. So we just don't know. This is really just shifting ownership for the ban off of the First Presidency and saying, it's out of our hands, guys. I know we have the ability to convene with God in the temple. We can ask and get answers. That's what we tell all of our members. Personal revelation. We can receive it for ourselves. The First Presidency, the prophet, the Quorum of the 12. We can receive revelation for the church, but for some reason, we can't get an answer on this one. God will not tell us on this idea of why it's here. And the conclusion that comes from this is we can't change it because God won't tell us why, and God won't tell us to change it. The question remains, could you ask to change it? Probably. I mean, that's what's going to happen in 1978 via the journals kept by the prophet at that time, and we'll talk about that later. But at this point, that's just not the case. We can't talk about it because there's so many voices that disagree on it. It's just going to end in an argument. It's just going to end in disagreement. So why are we even going to spend our time on the issue? We're just awaiting revelation from God, and at that point, we will see the end of the racial priesthood ban. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in to the Great and Spacious Building this week. We're getting to the lifting of the priesthood ban, and I'm thinking about going back and throwing in some more filler episodes for some of the things that I've had to sort of gloss over since we're taking a broad strokes brush approach here. But until then, we should be at the 1978 revelation in 2 or 3 episodes. And like I said, we might expand it after that. But don't forget, in December, we will be starting our book study of the 2 biographies of Joseph Smith. So first one, we've got No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody. And we will be comparing that to the most recent entry into the biography of Joseph Smith world, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet by Dr. John G. Turner. These 2 books are absolutely phenomenal. I'll end up eventually I'm going to open up the community function of the page and I'll post a reading guide. I'll probably do that this week this time. But if you want to get started, the first Wednesday in December, we will be starting the book. So in No Man Knows My History, that episode will be focused on chapter 1 of that book. And to have the John G. Turner part, we will be reading chapters 1 and 2. So chapters 1 and 2 of John Turner's book, chapter 1 of Fawn Brody's book, and we'll be comparing those, and I'll be adding in some historical insight of what I thought was awesome, what I thought was a little bit lacking in either book, and maybe who I thought did it better. But until then, keep tuning into these episodes if you liked what you saw today. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. If you have, thank you. Glad that you're on the page. And like this video, leave a comment if you want to get into a discussion below. And I hope to see you all next week. Have a great day.